Um, I am Trinity Mills. I'm the Conservation Advocacy Specialist for Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy. Welcome to Advocacy 101. Our topic for this session is Loudoun and power. Just to go over some logistics, hopefully everyone here is familiar with Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy, assuming that you got this link from our mailing list. But just to go over, we are a membership-based, volunteer-driven nonprofit with the mission to inspire, motivate, and engage people to protect, preserve, and restore wildlife habitat with the goal of humans and wildlife thriving together. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We will go ahead and get started with the presentation, and we can take some questions at the end if anyone has them. So, wildlife and development in Virginia. This map right here is a demonstration of what is considered to be core habitat. Habitat loss is the greatest threat to wildlife and biodiversity as a whole. Destruction, fragmentation, and the degradation of wildlife habitat are what negatively impact the survivorship of wildlife and wildlife populations. In Virginia specifically, the conversion of natural habitat to residential and commercial development is the primary mechanism by which habitat is lost permanently in the state. That is according to DCR's records that is displayed in this map here. This map shows a record of what is called an ecological core. So these ecological cores are areas in which wildlife are able to thrive and function because they have enough space to do so without having significant development or human interference. So the dark red and orange areas are those that have the highest scores of habitat connectivity as well as wildlife feasibility. The dark green and yellow areas are the moderate scores as far as connectivity. And the unmarked areas are those areas in which the fragmentation of the habitat is too high for it to be considered an ecological core. So as you can see here in Loudoun, we have a good number of those cores towards the west, fewer towards the east because of the fact that these are the areas that are more densely populated and exposed to these development projects, as we'll go over tonight. So the power grid, the reason that everybody is here, from generation to distribution, we're relying on the stability of an extremely intricate system that does impact wildlife, but also impacts humans because of the fact that it is considered to be a necessity. That being said, those construction of the power lines, transmission lines, substations, those kind of things do still impact wildlife habitat, but because of the fact that they are considered to be a necessity, oftentimes the green space that these areas have to occupy pays the price. So to give you guys a little bit of background on what exactly it is that is driving this habitat loss for power consumption, it's helpful to get a little bit of an understanding of how the power grid works. So I'm going to play a video that kind of explains what the power grid is, so that you have some background information that'll help you understand what we'll talk about later on when it comes to the impacts of these projects on wildlife. So bear with me for a second while I get this video going. And please tell me if you cannot hear it. Can't hear it?
Yeah, we're not hearing that, Trinity.
Okay, no worries. I'm gonna quickly stop my share so that I can reshare with audio. Hopefully that video was helpful. I realize that there is a lot of technical jargon associated with this concept and the information that it takes to understand why power consumption is as it is in the county does also rely on a relative understanding of how the power grid works. So hopefully that video gave you a little bit more information and got you more connected to how the power grid works. And just to check back in, can everyone still hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. In optimizing for video, I lost my visual on you guys, so just making sure if you lose my audio, someone say something. So how Loudoun County power demand is at its current state. We're obviously experiencing a higher power demand than has been in previous years, and this is for a number of reasons. It has been said that Loudoun is the largest growing county in the state and at some points in the nation. Loudoun County's population has grown 35% in the last decade. The county's population growth, or the country's population growth over this time was 7.3%, and Virginia's was 7.7%. So our county specifically has grown vastly more than anywhere else in the country. And because of this higher population, more homes, more people consuming power, that has contributed to the stress on the power grid. The other large factor in the reason for the strain on the power grid and the increase in power demand, as you guys are probably very well aware, are data centers. There are currently over 25 million square feet of data centers that are operational in Loudoun County, and there are another 4 million that are currently in development. Data centers as a industry require an immense amount of power to operate. Essentially, they are gigantic boxes of electricity because of the function that they serve. Roughly, you can say that every data center requires approximately 60 megawatts of power. Substations, as you learned in the earlier video, they can handle the distribution of a max output of about 300 megawatts. And that is for each substation. So with the amount of data centers that are present in Loudoun County, more substations are needed to actually meet the demand of the output that is needed for those data centers to be operational, as well as the transmission lines that are needed to service to those substations. What this means is that power consumption across the county is to the point that the existing substations are essentially maxed out. That is, they are giving the maximum output they are able to give to the data centers that are currently present, as well as to the residences and commercial operations that already exist in the county. What this means, essentially, each new data center constructed must also accommodate a substation based on the amount of power that they require. So what do power projects mean for wildlife habitats specifically? I talked earlier about those ecological cores in areas that have industrial uses and are higher concentration as far as population. That leads to an increase in the degradation, fragmentation, and overall loss of habitat. The power lines that are needed to service all these areas further fragment, degrade, and destroy habitat. So the impacts of the new power lines and substations themselves, the construction will often harm the habitat as well as the actual placement of the transmission lines and substations themselves. The large reason for this is because the transmission lines have limited options for where the right-of-way that is needed to accommodate them can be placed. Because impacts to homes must be minimized, and the magnitude of power lines that are needed and was unfortunately never really worked into county planning because it was unprecedented and not expected. This means that green space is the thing that most often will get sacrificed for those power line and substation construction projects. Again, because it is considered to be a necessity. Fragmentation is the splitting of habitat that creates lines through habitat areas, and this can lead to something called barrier effects. Barrier effects happen from things like rights-of-ways for construction lines, fences, roads, essentially limiting the dispersal of habitat or wildlife and limiting gene flow. This can have pretty significant effects on wildlife, ranging from increased predation due to a lack of cover in right-of-ways, all the way to potential fertility issues from inbreeding and isolation of populations. The actual loss itself also will have a significant impact. The footprint of the project itself, being the substation where it's being placed that was once habitat and is now dedicated to the electricity. That physical cleared space where the lines are built. Not only is that significant, but that can also lead to even more loss of habitat, because sometimes the effects of the degradation and the fragmentation of those projects could be so severe as to render the remaining natural areas uninhabitable by the wildlife that needed that area. This is most true when you consider it in conjunction with all the other development projects that are happening in the same area that may cause the same types of problems, such as road projects. All this being said, these are very relevant to what will happen once the power line or substation is there itself, but also the construction process itself is severely disruptive due to noise, debris, and human disturbance in general. So excuse my typo there, but what makes power projects different from other development? This is because this is considered to be a necessity. Like said, Dominion or Novec is required to meet needs and demands of expanding development and is required to supply power to those that need it. These capacity concerns for the current grid require a building up of that grid. And the greater development, increased population are almost always the reason for more lines, more substations, etc. It's also very different than a traditional development project because of the fact that it requires more steps. It's a longer process and involves many more stakeholders that play different roles than would the traditional development project. So these many more steps that are required even before the point at which ground can be broken on a project. This can impact many things, stemming from how complicated the process to secure the right-of-way is for the power line. It may require the adjustment of zoning, so it may require a zoning application or a legislative application. The design process itself is also more complicated because of the fact that it must negate or avoid impacts to homes and other things. And then the fact that also said agencies such as Dominion or Novec must integrate a large variety of stakeholders in order to get that project going, specifically the incorporation of the SCC. So eminent domain, a buzzword that comes up when you think of power projects. Eminent domain is what allows the government to expropriate private property for public use. Power projects can be considered a public use because, like said, they are considered to be a necessity. Road projects also fall under this category. County supervisors has stated many times that this is a last resort, and negotiations will continue for as long as possible in which the county will have evaluations made of a certain area if it is determined that the power line or substation has no other options for where it can go except for through a private property area. So Loudoun's power suppliers are Dominion Energy and Novec. Dominion Energy is the one that we think of most often. That is where a lot of the power projects that Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy have focused on is in conjunction with Dominion. And we will be speaking on that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. So the current power projects that are LWC campaigns right now, Wishing Star to Mars is a high voltage transmission line along Broad Run between North Star Boulevard and Loudoun County Parkway. And then Aspen to Golden, which is a series of 5 substations along Goose Creek that connects 2 transmission lines along Route 7 to Broad Run. In our conversations about these projects, we are, of course, pushing for the protection of wildlife habitat and minimizing impacts to important areas such as Broad Run and the Goose Creek watershed. So our Executive Director, Michael Myers, is now going to go over some details of one of these campaigns in a case study format to give you guys a real-world perspective on how a power project plays into wildlife protection and what we are working on specifically to protect the wildlife in our area. So, Michael, I will turn it over to you. Would you like me to go ahead and keep on my screen share and just switch the slide for you, or would you like to take the presentation?
Yeah, that'd be great. And you can just slide over, page over on the presentation. So hi everyone. So as Trinity mentioned, this is going to be kind of a case study format of an application and a process currently going on. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So a couple of these maps are going to be a little bit difficult to read, so I apologize for that. But basically what's going on, this lists Dominion's current projects for what they're calling Loudoun reliability projects. As that video mentioned, reliability is one of the key needs. And all of these projects are specifically to get more power from the 500 kilovolt backbone, which is that purple line that you see that extends north-south across the county. You can see Beaver Dam Run or Beaver Dam Reservoir kind of there in the middle. So that's the main power source for Loudoun County. And so from there, they need to bring more power to the eastern part of the county where Data Center Alley is, which is sort of one of those oval yellow dash circles there. And so the Wishing Star to Mars proposal that already previously got passed is that one at the bottom, that red line there. And then the current one they're working on is the Aspen to Golden, which is sort of that orange yellow line. And then the green line is between those 2 substations. And so that is going to be, I guess, Mars to Golden, maybe was what they'll call it. But we'll be learning more about that in the near future. So basically, these are all 500 kilovolt lines, so big transmission lines, because they need to move a lot of power. And then there are a variety of associated substations with that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look into this Aspen to Golden a little bit more in depth, and I have some closer pictures of it to kind of give you a little bit more context. So we'll go to the next slide. And so here is the Aspen to Golden project. And I just want to give a little bit of context because you can see them a little bit more detail here. You still have the purple backbone off to the left there. And then there's a couple different routing options in that yellow area that essentially go from around Goose Creek on the west side over to Broad Run on the east side. Those X'd out lines, those are other routes that they considered. One was using trying to co-locate along the Dulles Greenway, and another along the W&OD trail, but those were not considered feasible options for a variety of reasons. But one thing that I want to step back for a moment and kind of this is an overview of sort of the complexities that were described by Trinity and in the video of the power grid. But like, what are the factors that are driving this need for power in Loudoun County? And to give some context, the average data center is about 60 milliwatts or megawatts of power. But so how much does 1 megawatt would power 250 homes? So that kind of gives you a bit of the scale of how exponentially larger data centers are than the average home or even a whole neighborhood of homes. So they're really driving huge demand. And so how do data centers why do we have so many data centers? Like, we could do a whole lesson on data centers. So on the brief overview, how do they get here? Is a couple different ways. Like, one is they're zoned what's called by right. So the zoning ordinance allows a data center to be built in a particular area. And that's where a lot of data centers end up getting built. They're typically these industrial areas. So it could be a warehouse, it could be a data center. In Loudoun County, more often than not, they are data centers. But it could be, is it for industrial, what's considered industrial buildings, which covers a broad swath of commercial properties. But then sometimes there needs to be a special exception. So the supervisors have to grant specific approval to rezone a property or have some other modifications to the property to allow for the zoning for a data center to be built. So the by right developments basically have administrative approval where we as the public don't have a say in that. The Board of Supervisors doesn't have a say in that. The zoning allows it, they can build it. But special exceptions go through that county process that we talk about all the time. And so it has to go through the Planning Commission referrals and the Board of Supervisors to vote on it. And so that's something where we can flex our own voices to try to influence those decisions, because we're being overrun by this collateral damage of the quantity of power that is needed by these. And so what has happened here in Loudoun County is that our comprehensive plan, there aren't any dedicated utility corridors in Loudoun County in our comprehensive plan to allow for this growth and this new demand for energy. So that's why we're seeing all these transmission projects, and they're just trying to squeeze them in where they can, because Dominion, as Trinity mentioned, has an obligation to provide power to new customers. When those new customers are data centers, they need a lot of power. And so what Dominion is now trying to do is figure out where they can squeeze them in. And as Trinity alluded to, habitat loss. And what happens is these green spaces have the habitat, and they don't have homes, so they impact fewer existing buildings. And so those are the only places left to build these transmission lines. There's a lot of other considerations in there. Oftentimes in applications, we'll see people want to have like reduced setbacks, which means that there's less space between a road and the building. And so in this project, it manifests in a couple different ways, where that just decreases the amount of space that they have right of way necessary to build a transmission line. Because these 500 kilovolt lines need 150 feet widths to be placed, which is one of the main constraints about where they can go. So that was a high overview. We'll go to the next slide, please. So we'll look a little bit more in depth about what can we do, both as an organization and you individually. We'll get a little bit more into what you can do individually in a little bit, and I'll let you know a little bit about what we are doing at Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy. So basically, we're tasked with making a bad situation slightly better at this juncture of the game. So as Trinity noted, Dominion has an obligation to get stakeholder input. And so we are an organization on what Dominion calls the Loudoun Reliability Engagement Group. And so in that, we give feedback and try to give local on-the-ground knowledge about what's happening on the ground, things that we feel are really worthy to avoid. And on this particular map, so this map, the road across the top there is Route 7. Loudoun County Parkway is along the left. Route 28 is along the right. And that's the Kincora development there along the right next to all those hash marks, which is a open space easement. And then you see those three little dots kind of right in the middle are along Broad Run. And that is where there's an active heron rookery. So that is one bit of local information that I provided to Dominion and their consultants, and they put it on the map. And you can see that that blue line kind of gives a wide berth around that heron rookery. And it's approximately 1,000 feet on that side, and that's due to the input that we gave them. So like that's a small win where we're making a bad situation a little bit better. And so our goals as Loudoun Wildlife is to protect our riparian buffers, wildlife corridors, mature trees, and all this valuable open space, such as the heron rookery. So we'll go to the next slide, please. And then there's a lot of complexities to these transmission lines. And so what you see here is that as Loudoun County Parkway is on the left, the blue line is one alternative. The orange line is another one. At the very bottom of this screen is Gloucester Parkway. Route 28 is still on the right-hand side there. And what you see between those two lines, colored lines, is Loudoun Water's facility. And so one thing that's complex, there's a big open space just to the north where the orange yellow line kind of jogs around. Well, that's because Loudoun Water is planning their future expansion. So that's another consideration that Dominion has to take into account. So there's a quadrant of trees there inside between the blue and the yellow lines. Well, those trees are already going to be destroyed by another project. So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, this habitat's going to get fragmented. Unfortunately, our preferred route would be along Loudoun County Parkway and the built infrastructure. But Loudoun Water also has plans to expand their administrative buildings along Loudoun County Parkway at the intersection of Loudoun County Parkway and Gloucester. So it seems that the likely path is going to be that more eastern route, which gets closer to Broad Run and does reduce the amount of mature trees in the riparian buffer, which is certainly unfortunate. But that's where we stand on this eastern route. And so now we're going to go to the next slide and take a look at the western side, where we have our concerns lie on this side. So on this map, on the right-hand side, we have Belmont Ridge Road. The kind of I don't know what to call that, light blue swath down the middle is Goose Creek and the scenic buffer for the state scenic river there. And then that purple on the left-hand side, that's that backbone that we see. And then you can also see Buckstone Quarry has sites both on the east and west side of Goose Creek in this area. And so a couple of things I want to note to point out is the conglomerate of substations off of that 500 kilovolt main line. So you see all those little triangles, those are substations and or proposed substations. So a couple of those substations have been approved. You will see on the western side of Goose Creek, there is a patch of trees. Well, guess what? That's already been approved to be a data center. So all those trees are going to be destroyed as well. On the east side of Goose Creek are also proposed to be data centers, and that is an area that has extra complexity because there's two data centers currently being built along Belmont Ridge Road where all those trees are. One is slightly to the north of this, which I'm getting ahead of myself, is Vantage. It has, both of these parcels have multiple zoning districts. So to not get too complicated, part of their zoning says they can build a by right data center, but part of it is zoned where they cannot build one by right, and they also are not allowed to build a substation by right. They need to get what's called a commission permit. And so what we're seeing is on the right-hand side, there where the blue line goes, there's two little triangles, and that represents the Belmont, what's called the Belmont Innovation Campus. And so what they're trying to do is they're proposing to put their substations on the left-hand side closer to the scenic river. Our preference would be to be further away from the river and closer to Belmont Ridge Road. However, Dominion, they have to provide power where the developer builds it. So they do have a little bit of say in that process, but not total say. And ultimately, it comes down to the developer. So with this particular Belmont Innovation, this project they're actually going to the Planning Commission for rezoning to consolidate all their parcels. So all of their parcels would allow them to build the data centers where they want to build them and put the substations where they want to build them as well. So we'll get into that a little bit more later, but I wanted to give you a little bit of context there. And so we'll go to the next slide, Trinity. And then so what we see here is where the orange line goes and all those trees between the orange and the blue line. That's where Vantage Data Centers has already started taking trees down, and they're currently constructing their data center buildings. Where you see those two white triangles, that is within the zoning district where it is not by right to build a substation, and they're going to need to go through what's called a commission permit, which is basically, by that it means the planning commission has to give approval for them to construct their substations in those locations. So that's going to be coming up in the future as well. But to make things complicated, that's two separate processes for zoning data centers and the substations. So we'll get into that a little bit more in the future. But one other thing I want to note here is this is Belmont Ridge Road going north and south, and then Route 7 is east and west. And that red hashed area, that's the Belmont Cemetery for the formerly enslaved cemetery. And so that's a cultural resource that Dominion did know about, but also local stakeholders were like, this must be protected at all costs. In addition to that, there's also a planned potential multi-use development on the east side of Belmont Ridge, which also complicates things as well. So on this side, I know we're throwing a lot of information at you, but there's multiple ways that you as the public can get involved. And so Trinity, let's go to the next slide. And so for Dominion in general, like all of these transmission power line projects, they are, as part of the stakeholder group, which comprises of a lot of different organizations are invited to attend those to provide local feedback on the ground. We have a series of meetings to try to nudge them in a better direction. They don't always follow the advice that we prefer, getting further away from the rivers, closer to the roads, protecting more of the trees. But we have had like minor wins here and there, and then they have public input sessions. And so there was actually one. They typically have been hosting 2 rounds of those. There was one last night, just last night. And then this website will take you to all of the Dominion projects that they have going on. So this is for their base site for Northern Virginia. And then if you want to submit a comment to them, they have an application called GeoVoice. So you can go on there, you can say, oh, by the way, there's a bald eagle nest here, and you can pin it on a map. Or there's, whatever it may be, you can provide comments, or you could just say, I don't want it here, or I don't want it there. But you can provide comments before they submit their application to the SCC. So the SCC is the State Corporation Commission. And so Dominion will have to file their proposal with them, and then that will also have a public comment period, which is very difficult to actually influence the decision at that stage. There's a variety of layers that go into that, but there's a state approval process for where the transmission lines go. So there's no local legislative process for where to put the transmission lines. However, as I just noted with the data center locations, those are opportunities for you all to get involved. And one of the things that I think is important for us to ask ourselves is, should we be making things easier for data centers to be built? Should Loudoun County be approving special exceptions to build more data centers where they are not currently allowed? These are all very important questions to continue pushing back to planning commissioners, the board of supervisors, throughout the process, wherever we can. I know we as an organization have limited capacity. I'm our full-time staff member. Trinity is one of our part-time staff members. And then we rely upon our volunteers and our members to submit comments and to really engage with supervisors to try to move the needle on these projects. So there's the data center rezonings, such as the Belmont Innovation Campus. That one's going to the Planning Commission public hearing on September 26th. And we'll be submitting some comments and posting that on our website ahead of time. So that's one of the things where we're not always able to, we always don't have the capacity to comment on every single data center application. But I think it's definitely a worthwhile effort to like push the needle and keep asking, why do we need to approve this? Why do we need to make things better for data centers? Why do we need to give concessions to data centers? So like the Belmont Innovation Campus, they are doing things that are more environmentally responsible than other data centers. But are they still having an extraordinary impact on the environment? Absolutely. So it gets into those types of discussions. And then, as I mentioned before, the commission permits for substations. So there will be some of those coming down, and those are another opportunity to raise our concerns to the Planning Commission and be like, hey, you don't have to approve this, and really pushing back on, they're like, well, we have to. It's like, nah, not necessarily. No, you don't. Not if we're changing the rules, or we're allowing exceptions. That's why it's an exception to the rule. And then also another thing that to keep an eye out for is zoning ordinance amendments. Currently, we're undergoing the zoning ordinance rewrite process. There are some very minor changes to design standards for data centers, but the Loudoun County is already putting forward a series of future zoning ordinance amendments to address a variety of topics, some of which are data center sustainability standards. And they're also have already approved to look at where should data centers be allowed by right. And so that zoning ordinance amendment process and multiple zoning ordinance amendments that are already going to be in the pipeline are another opportunity for you to reach out to your supervisors and be like, hey, I don't think we should have more data centers. We should limit where we put them. We should be more thoughtful about where we put them and the standards that they need, whether it's screening and buffering, where they place their cooling vents, what type of backup generators they have, all of those best management practices. And so I know there's a lot of other groups besides us who are providing input and have knowledge base on the impacts of data centers and what kind of best management practices they could have. But those will be opportunities for you as a citizen to get involved on the local level to have a positive change on what's happening here. So I just threw a lot of information at you. We try to keep it a high level, but bring it back around to what you can do. And so I'll turn it back over to Trinity.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michael. I hope that that case study approach also aided in your understanding of how Loudoun County power projects operate and what we do to help protect wildlife habitat from the damage that these projects may inflict. So I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. We have a few minutes to take questions. Bear in mind that myself nor Michael are electrical engineers, so super technical questions, we may have to forward you some information later, but any questions on the actual process, wildlife impacts, that kind of thing, we'll go ahead and take now.
This is Ed Korak. I've been up here since 1981, and originally on the WNOD trail, the intent when they put the substations was for flip phones and faxes, and we know Dominion Energy went over that. The question is, why do we have more and more data centers here? It's all about the money, honey. If there is a stat I use for a financial group that I'm involved with in Florida on Zoom, the latest stat indicated that the county got $576 million last year for personal property tax on the number of servers. Number one. Number two, over 700 million. In relation to the power demands, they're going to become outrageous, Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy members, because right now with artificial intelligence, I'm almost willing to bet that the data centers that are going up now are going to be built as artificial intelligence centers, where they'll use a company called NVIDIA's chips, the GPUs. That'll bring even more stuff in here. And as I've seen all of this come, it's all about the money, honey. Let's face it, developers run the county, because when you have a budget of over $3 billion in the county per year, they're going to need the money to come from somewhere. Question about specifically about why here we have all of this virgin land, and eventually it's going to get out to Western Loudoun. So you're going to have, I live in Ashburn, the data center capital of the world. You go down Loudoun County Parkway, you see that. And the only way you're ever going to be able to stop it, as Michael has indicated, is by the citizens to get really totally involved in this, because we are losing the habitat here. So remember, when I came here in 1981, Route 28 was a 2-lane country road. WNOD from Sterling on to the Loudoun County High School was just fine crushed gravel. And there was a saying then, don't let Loudoun be Fairfaxed. So I guess the only way that you can do it is just keep pressing on. The mark of a organization is we never give up. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Some really good points in there. Any other questions regarding any of the things that we spoke about this evening? If you want to put it in the chat or just say it.
I have a question. When's the next meeting you want us to go attend?
That is a great question. And Michael can confirm this as I say it, but I believe that the meeting that is happening on the 26th will have a pretty big component. We'll send out some information very soon once we have it all completely compiled, because we did just get that date given to us a couple days ago. But that would be the next date that I'll say now. We'll give you more information on everything that will be going into that day and what you guys can help with on that day for that business meeting with the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah, and then in terms of the zoning ordinance rewrite process, there's not a ton of changes with the data center specific stuff. They will be breaking down work sessions starting in September going into October, where we'll have comments on, but it'll be looking into that the future ZOAMs or zoning ordinance amendments are all kind of TBD based on whatever the Board of Supervisors approves for the Department of Zoning's work plan. So that's going to be determined in the future. And then yeah, so that one coming up. And then I don't know that there's a deadline to submit comments to Dominion, but that's kind of ongoing for right now. They're planning on submitting their application for this current transmission line in the fourth quarter of this year, so later this fall, like October, November timeframe. So if you do have something to say on the location of the transmission lines, you need to go onto that Dominion Nova website to submit comments.
And you can find that website linked on our website on the current campaigns page for the Dominion projects. If you do want to submit comments through that, you can also just search for the Dominion Nova projects page. It'll give you the links, or if you have more intense questions that you want to ask about, you can email me, which I'll put my email book up after.
I would say that the other thing that we can focus on is who we vote for. Because I know that when I did go to my supervisor and with a letter and said, this is what we need with one of the first data centers that went in near Goose Creek, made all the cases that I learned from the Wildlife Conservancy. And the response I got kind of shocked me. It just said, do you know how many schools we can build with the money from this data center. And I did not expect that. And so I thought, okay, this is really about, if we're talking about the commissioners or anyone else involved in the zoning, the people we vote for. We've got an election coming up pretty soon. I don't know if anybody in that group, I feel like that there would be several that would be involved in this. But I think it's about voting and encouraging people to vote who believe as we all do, that these data centers are so damaging, to our county.
That's a great point, Nancy. And one thing I would like to add too is one of the other groups that we work with is the Loudoun County Preservation and Conservation Coalition, and they do have like a work group that is studying and evaluating, data centers and the financial impacts of them. And they put out some great work and great reports. Jim Hanna and others on that work group about Loudoun County's over reliance on data center revenues and how that's not a sustainable model. And that goes to Ed's comment as a little bit as well. And then there's other things that we're working with partners and other coalitions, and we're starting to get a statewide data center reform coalition going to see how can we help influence action at the state level to regulate this industry. So that's kind of coming together behind the scenes as well between a lot of partners. So there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes that we might not always put out there, that we're looking out, and then we're just trying to funnel the information to you all and how you all can help as individuals as well.
Yeah, and Jim, I saw your question. Yeah, it's the Loudoun County Conservation and Preservation Coalition. Gary put a link in, so thank you, Gary. You have about 5 minutes left. Probably have time for one more question. Oh, Nancy, go ahead.
I have a question. So am I correct in saying that the reason that data centers are being built is because we are using people are asking for the services they provide, and I was wondering, are there ways that personally people can help by reducing the need for data centers? Because even if we keep them out of Loudoun County, then if we're still making more demand for them, they're going to be built someplace else where it's also going to be impacting the wildlife and the environment.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'll say one thing on it, and then I know Michael has a couple points for it, but I will say that the demand for data centers is less a individual and more of an industrial issue. It's something that people may try to take personal responsibility for, but it is something that I like to be explicit and say that it's one of those things where, using your electric toothbrush that's reusable rather than like a disposable plastic one is helpful. But in this way, you deciding not to store your photos on the cloud is going to have such a negligible impact to the overall issue, because of, like Ed mentioned to earlier, it is a financial incentive for the industry in general. It's the revenue that the industry generates for the county that is driving the demand, rather than the individuals using the service that is provided, if that makes sense. Michael, whatever you had to say as well.
Yeah, and so kind of to answer the question a little bit, I know this might take us a little bit over, but then we could, if people want to stay for other questions, we can do that as well. But so much of our society is now going towards so much reliability on the cloud or artificial intelligence, and those evolving technologies are only increasing. So it would take a groundswell of overwhelming proportions of a grassroots effort to shift the paradigm away from where society is going. Everything from your smartphone and storing things in the cloud to smart refrigerators and smart technologies. You see, car companies are saying the best tech you will have is in your driveway. Well, guess what? That's constantly connecting to the cloud. and constantly driving the demand for more reliability. Self-driving cars need to have a lot of reliability. They cannot have, they have to be reliable and connecting to the cloud in order to function. And so we're seeing more and more of those technologies are just happening. So that's increasing the demand. At the same time, there's also evolving technologies to make the data centers, the servers more compact, so they can do more computing power. However, that's going to drive a need for more energy to power them. So it's kind of this vicious cycle, which is very, very difficult to overcome at this point. So it's like so some of the answers to the questions are, well, how do we do this more sustainably? How do we site them in more appropriate places? How do we have better building standards for them? And those types of things. And I will defer. I see Julie has her hand up. So Julie Bolthouse works with PEC, Piedmont Environmental Council. So Julie, do you have something you want to add on this topic?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I completely agree with what you just said. And I just want to add, just for a little bit more explanation, to me, the data center industry is sort of like the automobile. Think about when it first came out, you know, it had no seatbelts, it wasn't safe, the emissions from it were significant. And if the push had been, okay, nobody drive, that wouldn't make any sense. Society would not have accepted that. And I think we you know, cannot make that argument. We cannot say you can't have data, you can't have remote meetings like this, you can't have you know, additional technology for AI and all this other stuff. But what you can do, and what we did with the automobile, is you can have additional regulatory oversight, and you can come from the top down. And you think about the emission controls that we put onto our cars. Our cars now emit, like, I think it's 99% of the emissions have been eliminated because of the regulatory oversight that we put on the industry. And not just at the automobile, also at the oil refineries and other areas. So my point in saying that is that you're right. You're not going to see this huge groundswell of people just stopping using AI or energy intensive computing. But what we can see is additional regulatory oversight.
And there's a,
Can I just say, everybody look away from their computer for a minute at the sunset. It is spectacular. So look out your window and see it, and then come back.
I'm too deep in the trees.
Gorgeous. Right.
Do we
We
have,
do have a question in the chat from Leah. Is data center storage and use something ESG scores take into account? That is a technical question that I personally do not know the answer to.
I'm not sure that I know what the initials ESG stands for.
Leah, would you like to clarify?
I think
Yeah,
it has
sorry.
to do with
Can you guys hear me?
sustainability.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, it's a sustainability measure, basically, that it's a new rating for companies. I think Apple is like rated #1, but I'm sure they also use, I mean, it's something that I'm just curious about, because are they supposedly, I believe that companies that are web-based are ranked higher generally. I don't know for sure, but that's something I'm curious to know more about, because if they are, then they're using data centers, which is, you know, doing all the things that we just discussed with wildlife degradation and habitat fragmentation and so forth.
it stands for environmental, social, and governance is the acronym.
Right. So I don't know the answer to that question. And I had a response to kind of address that. Oh, and I forgot. Hold on, I got it back. So when data centers state that they are, you know, their goal is to use renewable energy sources to offset the energy consumption. Well, one of the issues is that the demand has increased so much recently, and they're still trying to build the renewable energy infrastructure. There's just not enough to keep up. So the reality is that we're falling behind our goals because our demand is outpacing the amount of renewable energy that we can currently create. And so to that end, for example, like Dominion is now saying that they are not going to be able to meet the Virginia clean economy goals set forward because there's such high energy demand, and they're not going to be able to take offline fossil fuel burning power plants when they previously thought, because the energy demand has increased and they still need those power plants online to generate energy. So in those ways, I feel that it's probably a similar analogy where I don't know if it takes into account into their scores or goals, but there's going to be some lag there where it's just not like in this situation is probably similar, where they say they're doing something really good, but it's still just not catching up because the technologies and the consumption's evolving so quickly. So I don't know if it's taking into account in those specific goals and scores, but there's going to be some lag where it's likely misleading on the types of impact they're having.
And Michael, can I just add on to that, that part of the problem is that we don't really know what their energy efficiency really is, what their energy consumption is, what their water consumption is. So they put all these, they put reports out on their ESG and what they've done in the communities, but there's usually very little data to actually verify what they've actually put out there. And if you want to check out what I'm talking about, there's an article in the Business Insider about Amazon in Virginia and their amount that they've put into renewable energy and how little information is actually out there to show in reality are they doing it, because they say that they have put 100% renewable energy onto the grid to meet their energy demand from their data centers, but there's nothing out there to actually prove that.
That's an excellent point.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you. And then Kimberly said they had a question.
Yeah, that was me. Hi, I'm Tyler. Lived in Loudoun County for like 20 years now. So, but I wanted to go back to when someone said it's all about the money, honey. And that's why demand for more electricity and more data centers, that's why there is more demand. The demand goes up, due to these companies and organizations that profit off of these data centers going up. So I guess, does anyone have any thoughts on the best way to remedy or at least fight sort of those organizations that have profit as their top priority, as opposed to environmental and ecological health? Or is that sort of a lost cause?
I mean, it's a big question. That's a big question. I think to try to keep a fairly simple answer, there's a couple different levels that we've touched upon. One is, should we be providing incentives to encourage more data centers to be built, or like in that, I mean, allow special exceptions to be approved? Would be one way to legislate and regulate. And then, as Julie also mentioned, it's about creating top-down regulations so they have better standards, because we're not necessarily going to stop it, but if we can make them have more energy efficient buildings, or to have better business practices, or to put their cooling vents in certain locations, or to reduce their noise emissions, or force them to have wider buffers, or better creating better habitat, or not destroying as much habitat. Those are all things where we can create regulations to end up with a better end result, which I think helps the situation we're in. It doesn't necessarily answer your question precisely, but I think that those are some things that we have within our control, because the demand is going to keep going up. And in terms of like, why are data centers here in Loudoun? Part of it is keeping up with the Joneses. There's so much infrastructure already here that the data centers are like, we need to be in Loudoun County. We need to be in Northern Virginia. We need to be close to all of these other things. And so there's a variety of other reasons that we could spend a whole day on, like, why data centers are here and what their demand is. and all those factors. So, but that I'll just leave it at that. But it's very complex. But like we can influence decisions at the county level and at the state level, because that's something that we have a little bit more control over to end up with better buildings, better siting, better regulations.
Yeah. I'll just repeat what Julie wrote in the chat, which is a very concise, good way to put.
Actually,
essentially.
actually, I didn't really word it very well in the chat. I'll just say it
Yes.
real quick. So
Please do.
basically what I'm saying is set the regulatory standard and then they have to meet it. And if they don't meet the regulatory standard, they're fined and they lose money.
And I will say in Virginia, we're what's called a Dillon rule state. So the counties can't make more restrictive legislation than what's at the state level. But if the state level doesn't have anything on it, then the counties are kind of left up to their own regulations. So that's why it is vitally important to have good state regulations, but then also we'll have the benefits at the county level. So it's sort of, we have to keep an eye on both, because if the state has really poor regulations, we can't have more strict regulations at the county level, even if we want to. There are some nuances there where like Northern Virginia is accepted from certain things, but it's infinitely more complicated and complex. So I will put that out there too, why it's important for us to advocate at the state level for this stuff as well as at the county level.
Yeah. Let me add some more stuff. Some of you may have seen in the Loudoun Now newspaper, the Loudoun Times Mirror, that Dominion is going to be building, I think it's 535 acres of solar panel arrays, pushing out 100 megawatts, and then a battery storage facility pushing out 50 megawatts. And they're also going into Southwest Virginia to quote, build a prototype of a small nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
That is something interesting, because if that works, and it'll probably be a long time, where would they want to put more nuclear power plants? Small ones, right in Loudoun County, because we're right by Potomac River. I just want to, just so everybody understands why I'm pushing nuclear power. Back in the day, when I was probably younger than you, Tyler, I was on nuclear power attack submarines out of Pearl Harbor. And so that worked well. We generated power probably equivalent to a data center, 60 megawatts. So I think that may be a thing to look into, that if it works, if we're the exception and that we need power up here, and Dominion will say to all of us, we have the infrastructure. It's easy for us to pump power up here. So I think the county will be eventually built out of data centers. And one last thing is the research that I said is these AI data centers that are being built take a heck of a lot more power than the regular data centers. And some of the data centers, it's my understanding, are now converting to AI, which basically they use a product called a general graphics processing unit by a company called NVIDIA. So they can, that'll even require more power, because once they make that conversion, that's where you're going to have the thing. I personally don't see any change into it, because wherever I go through the county, I see data centers that look bigger than the Pentagon. So it's going to be a tough one, but I think if you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, they'll eventually hear you, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Thank you.
And Ed, in your experience, so the power plants use the water from the river to cool down the systems. And I lived in Morgantown for 4 years, West Virginia. It's like along the Monongahela River. And we have a few power plants just around Morgantown. And they had noticed that the ecosystems around those power plants were starting to die off, because it changes the temperature of the natural ecosystem in that river. So I think it is probably the lesser of two evils than knocking down a bunch of trees. But yeah, so that's another thought, but I guess, that is a cleaner way of getting energy for sure, right?
And the energy in this country is not going to decline because the power companies will say, what about climate change? That's
Right.
another driver that we're going to be starting to see more and more.
Thank you guys. I do see some people saying that they need to head out in the chat. So if there are not any more questions, we will go ahead and wrap up. If you do have further things that you want to discuss or more detailed questions, do feel free to reach out. I will put my email in the chat just in case anybody needs it to ask questions. Otherwise, I will say thank you so much for coming. I hope this has been beneficial and not too doomsday for you. If you have questions, like said, please do reach out and please do speak up when it comes time to help influence these decisions that are being made to protect that habitat from these power projects. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.